Hi everyone! In the last video we talked about GTO versus exploitative play and how we should sort of focus on the different aspects of poker, which one of those is more important in different scenarios and so on. So in this video I want to talk about how hard you should exploit people. There's sort of a discussion between do you want to just make small exploits and then have those play out over a very long time period, or do you want to go really hard and just exploit massively, do something 100% of the time? If you think your opponent's folding a bit too much, just always bluff and whatever else. So I'm going to talk a bit about that in this video, but before I do, I want to take a little rewind and just talk a bit about how people think in general, and then how we can apply that to the game of poker and how people are naturally going to react to things, and therefore how you should take advantage of that. So we're going to rewind a little bit and step back and say, let's play a little game. It's just a game I've made up. I don't think anyone's ever played it, but the game goes like this. You're playing this game for an amount of money which is sort of significant for the other person, but not really like life-changing or anything. Just kind of, they want to win, basically. They want to think about it and win. They're going to put a bit of thought into it, but they're not going to like really hate their life if they lose and be destitute or anything. So the game's this. The other person, your opponent, has to pick a number between 1 and 10. You have to guess which number they've picked. And the payouts of this game are that they get an amount of money from you if you get it wrong that is equivalent to the number that they have picked. So the simplest would be that 10 gets them $10 and 9 gets them $9, 8 gets them $8, etc. But you could multiply that by 10 or 100 or whatever it is, just to get to an amount that your general opponents care about but isn't huge for them. So on the other hand, if you guess right, then they have to pay you that amount. So if it was 10, they would pay you $10. If it was 9, they would pay you $9, 8, $8, etc. So this game's heavily weighted in favour of your opponent, and a key thing here is you're not allowed to use a mixed strategy. You have to just pick a number and then write it down on a piece of paper, and then you're playing multiple opponents, and every time you just have to bring out the same number. So there's no Nash equilibrium or anything. It's just an exploitative game. You've got to try and think about what number is going to be chosen by most people. How are they going to think? What's the end result of their thoughts going to be? What are they going to go for? So I want you to pause the video for a minute and actually think about this, like think through it. What do you think? What would your number be that you're going to guess against just a general population? What are people going to go for, and what are you therefore going to guess to try and win this game? So pause the video for a second now and have a think about that, and then I'll talk a bit about it afterwards. Okay, so I imagine some of you immediately, without thinking, probably didn't even pause the video if you picked this, just went for 10. Like, it's the easiest one. Don't know what people are going to go for. I'll just pick 10 because if I'm right, then I get 10, and if they don't bother thinking about it, or they try for the max, I can't lose 10 if I go 10, and I can get 10 or whatever. So I expect most people aren't actually going to go 10 though. I expect you're thinking that because you haven't thought about it, like you've just you just can't be bothered or whatever, because it's some crap little game that I made up at the start of this video about poker, and it's nothing to do with poker. So I imagine those of you who thought more about it, you kind of go through this process of like, okay, so I'm not going to do 10 because that's like, they're not going to go 10 because they're going to think like, oh, I won't get 10 because I don't want to give away 10, and that's the most obvious thing to do. So what about 9? And then they start thinking like, well, 9, well, the person's thinking about it from the other person's perspective. They're going to be like, well, I won't get 10, but then isn't it a bit obvious that I go 9 then? Like, it's just a bit, he might think like, oh, I'm not going to go 10, so I'll just go 9 and or whatever. And then you go down to 8, and you kind of weigh this up as to the more you think about it, kind of the more down you go through the numbers in terms of, well, if I want to pick one where this is from your opponent's perspective, you're thinking your opponent will be thinking, well, if I want to pick one that they're definitely not going to get, then I'm going to keep going lower and lower and think about it. So I expect most of you probably ended up going for something from 7 to 9, probably 7 or 8 maybe, as the number you think most people will pick. And disappointingly for you all, after you're now invested in this game, I've got no idea what people will pick because I've never played this game with anyone and I've just made it up. But I suspect it probably would be 6 to 9 somewhere. Most people would probably pick in the range of those. So you've probably, being poker players and thinking about these things, you've probably done a reasonable job at estimating what other people are going to think and what number they would pick. And you probably also thought that it depends on how much the money is. As the money got astronomical, then most people would probably actually pick a very low number just because they want to be safe. They might go down to 3 or something, or maybe a 5. Just be like, okay, they're never going to guess that low. It's not such a big risk, even if they do, because it's a smaller amount of money, and they would just stay away from the top ones. But for most people, in a game which is like the game that you're playing when you're playing poker with an amount of buy-ins which is well within your bankroll, then they're going to go for something that sort of 6 to 9 range. Just try and probably 7 or 8, maybe 9. But the point is that I imagine very few of you will have thought about it, gone down that process of 10, 9, 8, 7, maybe 7, 8, 6, something like that, and then the thought crossed your mind, like, hang on a second, like 10 would be really good if I was in my opponent's spot, because like I'm versus me when I'm thinking like of all these things and what the opponent's thinking, because 10, it's very rare that you kind of go back up to 10. You don't jump back from your sort of thought process of going down, well, 10's too obvious, and then 9, maybe that's too obvious, like 8, 7 or whatever. It's rare that you kind of go down that path and then like, hang on a second, I'm thinking between 7 and 8 here, so they should really just go 10, because I'm not even thinking about going 10 anymore. And I think that like you are right to go 7 or 8, because most people on the other side will go 7 or 8. But if you're on the other side of it and you're playing someone who's thinking like you are about how to play this game versus the general population, you should be going 10. And some of you would go 10 as well in playing that spot, because you would work this out when you're on the other side of things. So what are we taking from this very scientific experiment that never actually happened? Well, the point that I'm trying to get across is that when you have any sort of game where there's a sort of clash of minds and people are trying to think what the other person's going to do, and people tend to discount the most obvious and hardcore exploits. And that remains true in poker and other things. I did this game theory course on Coursera after I'd stopped playing poker a little while ago, just because I wanted to learn a bit more about, I knew about game theory as it applied to poker, but not so much about other things. And just as part of that, they had these sort of random games throughout it that you played against other students on the course. They were sort of not real time. The sort of thing that I just made up. This wasn't one of the games, the one that I made up there, but they had similar things where you could kind of pick something in advance and play versus students who've already picked their own things and so on. And for pretty much all of the games, maybe even all of the games, the same thing applied. I would just go for the most hardcore exploit, and it would just crush the strategies of all these other students who are trying to think about game theory and trying to... So they're thinking about game theory, but they're exploitative games. And these people are trying to work out, what are other people thinking? They want to win because they're trying to do this course. They're trying to learn about this stuff and try and do well. But it's not, that's what I did in my game. It's not like life-changing money where there's no money involved, but they're not hugely bothered if they lose, but they're trying to win. And yeah, it just absolutely crushed pretty much every time. You pick the hardcore strategy and go for it again and again and again, and everyone else is trying to expect you to try and do this clever thing of working out, they wouldn't pick the hardcore, and then you go below that, and then maybe below that, and so on. So in answer to the question, how hard should you exploit, what I'm getting to with all of this prelude is that the answer is hard, usually. And I'm going to go through a few examples from my poker career and poker in general, and try and give you an idea of where you want to be exploiting hard and where you might want to be a bit calmer about things and take a more long-term view. I'd actually say in poker, it's kind of even more of an effect of the sort that I've been talking about because of the incomplete information. So people don't, and because things keep on going, so it's not a one-off thing, it's a continual game of spot after spot after spot. And because people don't have full information of when you're exploiting hard and when you aren't and so on, people get the wrong ideas of what you've been doing, and people never think as well, like even more than on a one-off situation, people don't think that you're going to be capable of going for the hard exploit again and again and again and like really pounding on them. Like obviously eventually people will work it out. If you did it for years and years on end, at some point people would think, hang on, this person is just constantly going for the hard exploit. Although, amusingly, they would probably, when they realise it, they would almost think, like, this person's a simpleton, they're just going for this easy, obvious strategy every time, and they're just an idiot. Actually, you've just been exploiting them for ages without them realising, and then they finally caught on. But, yeah, people assume that you're not going to keep going for the hard exploit. I've a couple of examples from my poker career on this point. I remember a long time ago I did this spreadsheet for 4-betting, and I calculated based on a 3-bet range and a 5-bet shoving range. So, the way I started it was that I worked out what sort of hands I expected people to 3-bet and then shove over a 4-bet. This was back a long time ago, before people were even flatting 4-bets, really. People used to think it was bad to flat 4-bets. They would either play shuffle fold. And so I would work out what hands were plus EV to 4-bet for value, and then call a shove with based on their shove range, and also whether or not it was plus EV to 4-bet bluff based on what I think they're getting it in with, what percentage of hands, and what percentage of hands they're 3-betting. So I would really have a very simple box for 4-bet bluffing of Y or N based on a 3-bet percentage and what I think they're 5-bet shoving. And there was this guy who was crushing party at the time. I can't actually remember his name, but he was one of the best players around back then. He used to play on Stars as well. I think a Canadian guy, but anyway. And he just 3-bet loads. And people used to fold too much to 3-bet, so it was good in general against the population. But after I'd done this work, I was really just following this like straight up. And from pretty much every position, I just had a Y, like based on looking at his stats and seeing his 3-bet percentage, and I just had a Y for 4-bet bluffing. So I was like, well, let's just do it and see how it goes. And literally 100% of my opens where he 3-bet me and I had a bluff, I would 4-bet bluff. And he was just going mad in chat, like what are you doing? What are you doing? But he's still 3-betting this like really wide range and still not really shoving any wider. And it was still like, I guess he would think like there's no way he's gonna 4-bet bluff me again. Like he's just 4-bet like the last 6 times that I've 3-bet. So, I'm just going to 3-bet light again. And like, what? He's 4-bet me again. Has he actually got it? He must have it this time. And like fold and whatever. And for the whole session, like I just did this. And obviously I couldn't do this forever. He did get wise to it eventually. But it's surprising how long you can often get away with these things. And people will think that, there's no way he's going to bluff me now based on the recent things he's done and so on. And one of the things that helped sort of made me really realise that later on, this was a good few years after the 4-bet incident, which was just this sort of one-off thing. But when I started using a randomizer while I played, so I had an RNG open and I would click it to get a number between 1 and 100 and make my decisions when I thought it should be a mixed strategy based on the number that came up on the randomizer. And there were spots where I would never have bluffed before previously, because I would have been like, I've just like triple barreled him 4 times in the last like 20 minutes and he's folded every time. So he's got to be desperate to call me, and I don't want to. So I'm not gonna bluff. I'll check here. And I started off with this randomizer, and then I'd be like occasionally, I don't want to bluff, he's just going to call me, but I've got like 95 on the randomizer, so we'll just do it, and like cover my eyes, and then they'd sort of tank and just be like so sick in the chat or whatever and fold, and I'd be like, oh, they're like folding. And I think this is like a normal thing, because if I was in their spot, I would be thinking like, well, you know, this guy's just triple barreled me 4 times and I folded every time. He's going to be thinking that I'm going to be desperate to call, so therefore when he does like triple barrel me again, I'm going to be like, oh, well, yeah, okay, they probably got it this time because they wouldn't bluff it because it just seems so obvious I'm going to call. But you don't give credit for other people to do that same thing. So I started doing this more and more and realising that, hey, this actually does just work quite a lot. If you've been pounding on someone for some reason, pardon me, for some reason, means you can pound on them even more sometimes, or quite often. So, yeah, the answer, back to the screen here, the answer is usually you can exploit quite hard. But I'm now going to go through a few of the different sort of things you want to think about when you're deciding how hard you want to exploit. So you want to exploit very hard when you're playing someone you don't play with a lot. So that's quite obvious, because if you're not going to play them again, you haven't played them before, but you happen to have a really good feeling for what they're going to do, you can just exploit to the absolute maximum, and you know that they can't adjust and whatever, because you're not really going to play them much again. And rare spots is kind of the same thing, but it's just you could play with someone quite a lot, but you don't play with them in this spot a lot because it's so rare. So again, you can exploit hard as long as the exploit isn't, you know, just so consistent with the rest of the game. So, for example, if they always call too much in loads of different spots, and then you're in some big pot and you're like, this particular spot is rare and I'm going to make the same exploit that I'm making everywhere else, then obviously that's a little bit different. But yeah, generally, if you're not in a spot with someone, or you're not even in a game with someone very often, then you might as well just exploit really hard when you do find yourself in a spot with them, rather than making a play that you think is lower EV because you want to be closer to GTO or something. There's no point doing that. Just take your EV while you can there. But yeah, so when you're playing in sort of a large player pool, people aren't generally going to notice your tendencies as well. So unless you're a big name, you know, in the player pool, known as one of the biggest winners, maybe people are studying your game to try and improve or whatever, then yeah, they're generally not going to notice their tendency. And even if they do, and you'll say bluffing too much, they'll call light one time, and then they'll be like, okay, he knows that I call light now, so he's not going to bluff me anymore, and then they'll go back to like overfolding if that's their tendency, and so on. And so that's sort of segueing from that. Bluff frequencies are generally the best, I would say, the best of overall spot for like exploiting hard. And the reason for that is that people get to see showdowns so rarely. Like if their leak is that they overfold versus your bets in a certain spot, and you're like, that means they're folding a lot. And particularly with sizings, you can do something there. Like if you're over betting and they're folding too much versus over bets, then they're really, you know, they're already not supposed to call very often versus over bets, and they're actually overfolding on top of that. So you're betting, say, 2 times a pot, and they should be calling a third of the time, but they're actually calling 20-25% of the time. Then it's going to take them quite a long time to get any sort of sample having called you to realise that you're overbet bluffing them too much. So you can really sort of take advantage of that. Also, even when people do call and find you bluffing, they then have to think about, well, he's just been caught bluffing, so is he going to keep bluffing? Like, are they going to keep bluffing me when I've just caught them bluffing? And then even if they do say, okay, I'm going to exploit and call a bit wider now, just because you're supposed to be bluffing more than you're supposed to be value betting more than you're bluffing anyway. So let's say you're betting pot, you should be 2/3 of your range should be value and 1/3 should be bluffs. And let's say you're just massively over bluffing and half your range is bluffs, then still half the time you're going to have a value hand. And when the other person runs into a couple of your value hands in a row, it's going to be very hard for them to not start thinking like, they've adjusted against me, they're not over bluffing me anymore, even though they're over bluffing against most people. They've kind of realised I don't fold so much, so now I should actually start folding more, or at least start trying to play GTO, and then they'll go back to their natural tendency of overfolding. So I would definitely say, when you're bluffing, especially in any sort of rarer spot or smaller spot which is not so noticeable, so it checks down to the river, or bet, check, bet type lines, if people fold too much in those spots, which they very often do, just pound on that really hard, is what I'm saying there. When overfolding versus someone who underbluffs, again, someone who underbluffs is generally going to be doing so because they're kind of a bit naturally scared, which is quite a normal reaction, but they're quite naturally scared of being caught bluffing. They don't want to lose money bluffing. Perhaps even they don't get to the spot where they underbluff with enough air, so maybe they don't bluff enough in a bet, check, bet spot, so bet flop, check turn, and then bet river. Perhaps they don't bluff enough there because they just barrel all their bluffs on the turn, for example. So they find themselves in this spot, and maybe they do bluff whenever they do have air, but they just don't have air very often. So there's going to be all sorts of reasons for people under bluffing, which are not likely to change when you overfold. Because something you've got to realise is that for most regs overfold in a lot of spots, I think. And if someone is therefore under bluffing as a general rule, even though the player pool of regs is kind of has a tendency to overfold a little bit rather than underfold, then this person is probably not exploiting very well in terms of their bluffing frequencies. So it's just their tendency that they find very difficult to do anything about. So you can really just fold all your bluff catchers in spots where they're under bluffing. Don't worry about, like, oh, but what if they notice and exploit me? They're probably not going to notice. They're playing a few tables. It's not noticeable when someone folds as well, especially in smaller spots, especially if they're folding quickly or so on. Like, someone just folds and you're not even looking at the table, you're doing something else. So people aren't going to notice that unless they specifically analyse you, and if you're playing games with bigger player pools or whatever, that's not going to happen very often. And finally, you want to exploit very hard when your opponent is messing up due to a conceptual error. And I say very hard, but obviously I mean very hard up to the point where they would adjust despite their conceptual error. So I gave an example, I think, in the last video of someone who thinks minimum defence frequencies mean that they need to defend half the time against a pot c-bet, and say actually it should be 60% fold, but they think it should be 50% in your fold. So therefore you can fold, and they're sort of like barreling you all the time because they think you're folding too often, or c-betting you all the time because they think you're folding too often, and you can exploit that to the point where, so you want them to like make these extra bad c-bets, so you can exploit them as hard as you can without like going to the point where they're no longer making these bad c-bets. So you couldn't go all the way down from like 60% fold to 45% fold, because then they would also think that you're not, that you should be folding more, and then they would stop doing these c-bets that they shouldn't be doing. Yeah. Oh, I want to say one more thing on this slide actually. I got a friend who played 500 Zoom a couple of years ago for a while, and he did a lot of analysis on the player pool and like some mistakes that people generally make, and he found a bunch of spots where the crowd just overfolds quite heavily, and one of them was small blind versus big blind, when you raise the small blind and triple barrel. So he decided to see, how much can we get away with this, and he literally he raised, I think, 60-70% of small blinds, which is wider than he should. He didn't want to go more than that because then people would start 3-betting him too much to sort of make it not profitable. And then he just barreled flop, turn, river with air 100% of time on most boards. There were some spots where he was like, well, I don't think I'm going to get overfolding here, but most spots it was 100% of air barreling, and then he tracked the results carefully, both overall and versus individual opponents who seemed to be, maybe they weren't overfolding. And the results were he played for a few months at 500 Zoom on PokerStars, which are some pretty tough games, and basically nobody adjusted to him properly. Like, the crowd was still overfolding versus him pretty heavily, and even a couple of players that he thought, oh, I think they might have adjusted versus me, it turned out that it was either just variance, or maybe they even did adjust for a little bit, and then they were like, oh, okay, he's seen that I've adjusted now, and then they go back to overfolding. So even something that seems kind of obvious like that, you can really get away with a lot, and if you're somewhat anonymous, like you're not Linus Love or whatever, with everyone studying your game. So that's something that I didn't expect. Even like when he told me about it, I was like, nah, like people are going to adjust. And then he showed me the results, and it was pretty clear. The sample was big enough that people were still overfolding months after he'd been barreling 100% of air, triple barreling. So exploit hard, guys, when you're bluffing especially. So times you want to exploit less hard. So overcalling versus someone who bluffs too much and who you play against often. And you can still exploit fairly hard here, but the problem is you're on that other side of things now, where you're going to be second guessing yourself. So you make a couple of really light calls versus someone, and all of a sudden you're like, well, this person's probably a good player. They're bluffing too much because they know most people overfold. So are they going to like adjust versus me and just keep over bluffing everyone else and just under bluff versus me? Should I like keep going with this? And then you end up going back to your natural tendency, which might be to overfold, and maybe they're just still over bluffing you. So it's very difficult to pull it off, to just continually call very, very light. And of course they might actually adjust. They might adjust an under bluff versus you, so it might not even be good. So I would recommend, for your own sanity as well as perhaps profitability, just exploiting a little less hard there. But make sure you are exploiting, because it's so easy to just make one light call somewhere and then not really realise that somewhere else you've been like, oh, but he's barreled me 4 times in a row and I folded, he's not going to barrel me again as a bluff, and fold another spot where you GTO would have been to call, and then you end up actually not overcalling at all, even though they're over bluffing. And I had, when I was playing high stakes at 2550, I knew that in the mid stakes especially, people generally overfolded in certain spots, especially sort of bet check bet type spots, and check down to the river and bet. So people were overfolding a lot in those spots, and therefore the players that were moving up to the high stakes and starting to start games with me and Katya and Red Baron and so on, who were playing high stakes, their games are very much built around bluffing too much in these spots, and also folding too much in spots where people underfold and so on. But so in those spots versus these guys who just come up, I was just like, right, I'll just call pretty much 100% of bluff catchers whenever they bet in these spots, and it worked really well. And I got away with it because they obviously, I wasn't playing with them a ton. They were just like starting to place in 2550 and starting to start some games. But yeah, I had people in the chat like, man, why do you always call me? It's ridiculous. Like, why do you always call me? And yeah, it's I'm not doing it in every spot, obviously. I'm doing it in spots where I know that they're going to be over bluffing as their sort of standard game that they've built from playing against the field that they've been playing against. And it's going to be difficult for them to adjust from that, because first of all, they're used to people sometimes calling them light at the mid stakes, and then they would just keep going because they know that the person's going to call them light one time and then go back to their natural tendencies. So I was basically just thinking about, how is this person thinking? What would I be doing in their spot? I've come up through the mid stakes, I'm bluffing all the time, it works really well. Even when people do call me light, they then stop calling me light very quickly because they think I'm going to adjust. And these are the really good, smart players, so they've come up through those stakes because they're very good and they're thinking in this smart way and sort of out-leveling these people and continuing to bluff them. So yeah, I just kept calling them, and it worked for as long as I was playing against them, I would say. So eventually, obviously, it wouldn't have continued to work, but it worked for quite a while. So, yeah, common spots versus regular opponents, where it will be extremely noticeable. So here I'm talking about things like obvious things, so 3-bet percentage. If someone folds so much to 3-bets that you think you can profitably 3-bet any 2 cards and you play against them all the time, if you 3-bet any 2 cards, it's very quickly not going to become profitable, because even if they have a totally wrong idea of what fold 3-bet percentage should be, if you should be 3-betting them, say 8% in some spot, and you're 3-betting them 100%, they're going to be exploiting very hard and adjusting their play a hell of a lot. So that's not going to work. And the same with, say, check raising on the flop. If people fold too much to check raises, you want to widen your range by some amount for check raising with bluff hands, but you can't just check raise 80% or something and expect people not to play wider versus your check raises, or stop c-betting so often. So obvious things, but yeah, just think about if there's a spot where the frequency you should be doing something is quite low, like a 3-bet percentage or a check raise percentage, you can't exploit so hard in that spot, especially when it's common. And then the final one is versus players that you expect will be analysing your play against them. So this might be if you're a heads-up player. I know this course isn't a heads-up course, but if you do ever play heads-up and you're playing multiple sessions against the same opponent and you know that they're going to keep playing you for quite some time, you want to keep some of these exploits open over the long term if you think that's going to be more profitable than, say, making one extremely light call somewhere where it's going to be really obvious that you've spotted that they're over bluffing in that spot, for example. And also, if like when I was playing against the guys, I actually tried for a while exploiting really hard against the Baron and Catcher and so on, and it didn't really go as well as it did versus the lower stakes guys and so on, because these people they're playing against you a lot and they're focusing on how you play, and they're noticing things, and they're looking at your stats away from the tables, and looking at your HUD stats for the games they're playing in versus you and so on. So you can't take these like huge exploits to the very, very highest level and start games at 50, 100 on stars against the same opponents all the time while exploiting them really hard. But other than that, to be honest, most of the time you can just exploit really hard. So yes, we'll finish this video then saying that what you want to do in all of these situations is realise how you naturally act in situations. And this is going back to the random game that I started this video with, but the chances are that others act the same as the way you want to naturally act. But it's important to think about how you actually act at the end of the day, and not your first thought or how you think you would act. So an example would be this thing of when someone has triple barreled 4 times, or you've triple barreled 4 times and the opponent's folded, and then you're like, well, they're not going to want to fold, they're going to want to call me if I triple barrel again, so you don't bluff. But that's like the first thought. That's not necessarily how the other person actually acts, because if you really thought about it, when you really find yourself in that other situation, you might actually be like, oh, they barreled me 4 times and they're not going to bluff me now because it's so obvious that I'm going to call light. So therefore, I will make this really big fold because I think they're just going to have a value hand. So you need to realise how you're actually behaving naturally. Obviously, if you've realised that and changed your behaviour, that's a different thing. But if you need to give other people credit. Like, you're there in that spot where they're triple barreling for the 5th time, and you're congratulating yourself on such a disciplined fold, and oh yeah, they were never bluffing, this is a great fold, I'm such a great player, and then you're not realising that everyone else is doing the same thing, and that's the spot when it really comes down to it. So yeah, try to check these things, and any time that you can, check these things using Holder Manager, Poker Tracker. So when you think that you've been overcalling versus someone because they overbluff, check it, because there's a decent chance you haven't been. And when you think you're over bluffing, the same, check it, because it's so easy to, if you have this vision in your head of how GTA play looks, and you're trying to adjust from there, but your vision is incorrect, and you make decisions for other reasons at various times. Maybe you don't have time to think about this potential bluff because you've got action on another table, or maybe you're not going to bluff in this spot because you think they're going to call light, but yeah, you're exploiting by over bluffing at other times, so it's fine. And you can end up with your frequencies being different from the ones you think you think you have. So I'd really encourage you to keep a close eye on your own game and your own stats in all these different spots. Think about how other people are going to be perceiving you and how you want to adjust for that. But most of all, I want the message from this video to be that while I'm going to be teaching this course for the most part on game theory optimal concepts, because that's the stuff that kind of needs the most teaching, I really want you to get in the mindset of I'm learning this GTO stuff so that I can exploit my opponents as hard as I can get away with, and that will be what increases your win rate by the most. So that's about it for this video, and I think our next video I'm going to go through something which I call the theory of betting, which is something that I came up with just some time ages ago when I was bored, and I was trying to think about the difference between the old way of thinking, the way I had thought about the game, where I thought about things as value and bluffs, and try and bring that into the new arena, which I'd learned through solvers of all these mixed strategies going on, and trying to work out sort of why that was the case. So it'll be a very theory heavy video, and it's not hugely applicable in practice, but I think it will help people to understand poker a little bit better, so I think it's worth watching. So I'll see you guys then.